Great, welcome everybody for being here. And Raj and Will, thank you for letting me interview you. Why don't we just start off with quick intros? And I think the best way to do this, given that we've known each other for a long time, would be, why don't each of you talk about the first time you met each of us, and then I'll wrap it up. So Raj, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. So Brad, I met you the first time when I was going to school at MIT. You were guest lecturing at a course at Sloan, which is the management school there. And I went up to you after the lecture and introduced myself. So that was the first time. I think it was a very, very long time ago. I won't give the date, but I was a junior or maybe a senior in college. So it was a very long time ago. It was
almost exactly the same as you do today.
That's true. And it was a pretty incredible meeting. And then I think the next step of that, I'll go one step further, and then I'll talk about meeting Will. We had started our first business later that fall, and then I came up to you at another guest lecture. I heard that you were guest lecturing, and I wasn't in the class, but I literally went over to the class and wanted to go spend some time with you. And I caught you after class, and you said, "Hey, let's have lunch and we can talk about this new business that you're creating." So incredibly memorable first time meeting you. And then you introduced me to Will, and then we all got together, and Will started to jump in and mentor me and start to invest in the company that I was running at the time along with Brad. And then it was just sort of like away we went on building this incredible now 25, 26 year relationship, which is incredible.
Totally.
You just told everybody how old you are, Raj.
Yes, exactly. Old.
Well, you're
up. Let's see, Brad. I met you when you were still an undergrad at MIT. I specifically remember walking into a very dark dorm room and having Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon playing at a very high volume on some large, probably Klipsch speakers at the time, and a total memorable experience. We had, obviously, that just kicked off our relationship, and we've been working together and playing together a lot for a very long time since then. I met Raj through you, through Brad. He brought me in. Brad brought me in when Raj was founding his first company, NetGenesis, and we worked together. And I believe it was both of our first angel investments in a company. So it was another kickstart to a long relationship of cooperative deals.
And it was the very first angel investment that I made and that you made and that we made together, which is a memorable moment. I remember sketching it out with you and with Raj on a chalkboard in an MIT classroom.
There you go, chalkboard.
When a real chalkboard, like a black thing with chalk on it that you wrote and then on to erase it. And I remember none of the three of us knowing anything about equity investing or investing in startups, and sort of making it up and trying to figure it out as we went along. I remember the second Raj moment, not the first Raj moment. So I remember the going out to lunch, and I think that was a class I was teaching with Stefan Schroeder, who passed away a couple of years later. So it really cemented in my mind that class, because I think that was the last class I guest lectured for him on. And I don't know if you remember the place we went for lunch, but we went to an Italian place around the corner from my office. That was
I remember the office. I didn't remember the place. It was like One Liberty.
One Liberty office. I was in downtown Boston, and there was a Italian sit-down restaurant that was it had to have been a mob restaurant, because it was me in there regularly, and then like people that were not like they're scary Boston people. And for Will, what I remember most, I don't remember the speaker day, but I remember playing ping pong with you and with Dave Jilk somewhere, maybe at your office.
Might have been in my office, yeah, probably.
Like way early in the morning one day, talking about tech and entrepreneurship. So It's a delight to spend time with you. So let's dive in. You just released the second edition of the Startup Playbook. Why did you write this book in the first place?
Will, I'll let
Raj,
you
want to
take that.
kick us off here?
Okay, sure. I'll be happy to.
Raj, why did you write this book?
So it's actually remarkably simple. So I had the idea to write the book from talking to so many entrepreneurs and basically sitting down and probably giving the same type of advice or same thoughts every time I met with somebody. So my thought process was, why don't we get the basics out of the way? We'll hand somebody a manual, if you will, and let's get into the really interesting conversations that are far more unique or differentiated versus just the standard stuff. So, but all that standard stuff is super important. People need to know it. And I didn't feel like it was written down anywhere. So I had all this information from the 8-9 companies that we had started, and there was just all this information that we needed to get to people. So my thought process was, let's just write it down, give it to people so that when we talk to them, we actually can have a next generation, next level conversation rather than this first basics conversation where we can be more valuable on the second piece. So that was the idea.
Yeah, I'll even jump in there. As you know, Brad, you do it all the time. Raj and I have advised so many founders over the years, and it turned out the basic questions were all the same. Everybody was making the same kind of mistakes over and over again, which is sort of mind-boggling with the amount of information that's available out there. But people, would run into the wall and then continue to bang their head against the wall. And sort of our joint goal here was to just say, no, there's a wall there, and this is what the wall looks like. Stop banging your head against it. Let's try to shift the odds in your favor a little bit. And that was the origin of the book.
Y'all use a phrase regularly, and it's a phrase sort of woven throughout the book. It's the essence of the book, which is the phrase "founder to founder." And I don't want to highlight that, but I always sort of want to bring it out sort of more. Like, there's an enormous amount of content in the world. When you wrote the first book, blogging had become a thing. Writing books was still relatively new. Y'all were early-ish on the curve for entrepreneurship in that. But what was important about this idea of founder to founder advice, and how do you sort of weave it through your normal work as both Raj, entrepreneur, Will, board member, angel investor? Start with Will.
I think I'll start. I'll kick it off. The founder to founder thing was, when we talked about writing the book, we went out and we read most of the books that we could find. Turns out a lot of them have Brad Feld's name right on the byline. And what we found was that entrepreneurs don't spend the time to write books about their experience. They go out and start new companies. So we felt like there was really a dearth of information about founding a company from a founder's perspective. So that's the successes, the failures, the ins and outs, the sort of self-argument that you have and the argument you have with external parties. There are plenty of books by academicians. There are plenty of books by venture capitalists. There's plenty of books by accountants and lawyers and other constituents in the ecosystem, but really very few from the founder's perspective. And we wanted to give the idea, we want to sit on the same side of the table as the founder, the entrepreneur, and say, this is what it's like to be here. And this is what we learned from this perspective. And this is what we think you should learn too.
I think I might just add that we really wanted to be explicit about that bias. Everybody has biases when they talk or when they write and things like that. So we just wanted to make it explicit that our bias is towards the founder, from the founder's perspective. And I think that may be lost in some of the other material out there. And we just wanted to make sure that was always surfaced so that a founder knew to ask the question, hey, where's this person coming from when they write this article or they write this book, so that I understand maybe the inherent biases that are in this piece of work. and we obviously are very explicit about our bias, that it's from the founder's perspective. So if a venture capitalist were to pick up the book, or an accountant or a lawyer or somebody like that, they would see that some of the perspectives would be very different than theirs, and that's fine. But at least we surface that.
Obviously, founder to founder implies that your audience is founders. I know with the first edition, I think you've sold over 10,000 copies of the book, so it's been a popular book in the context of a business book. Have you had feedback from non-founders, from people in the ecosystem, whether it's VCs or angel investors or lawyers or accountants? Are they targets for the book as well, or are you really just focused on founders?
I'll go ahead and jump in. Yeah, we have had feedback from all of those folks, and I think they've also appreciated the book from the perspective of, they now understand the founder's perspective maybe a little bit better. So that, and they also can share that with either their entrepreneurs that they advise or they've invested in, and it just provides a holistic perspective. So that, I think we've had good feedback from folks on that. And then we've also had feedback like, hey, I disagree with this point that you have, but I understand why you have it, because you're coming from a founder's perspective.
Let's stay on the founder theme and sort of time travel back to each of your first company. And I'll start with Raj on this. If you could go back to when you were founding NetGenesis, maybe in the first year or two of the company, and you could sort of time travel back and tell your younger self, hey, younger self, do this differently. And your younger self would listen to you, which is, a big assumption.
Yeah.
What would you have told your younger self?
I think there's two things. I'm not sure I would have listened, but I think these are the two things that we probably should really highlight for everybody. And there were two remarkably simple things. One is, there should only be one person in charge. I mean, we had 6 founders at the beginning of NetGenesis. All of us were basically viewed ourselves as equal, and in a sense, everything got made as a group decision, and that can't work long term. So, and it doesn't even work short term. So I'd say that would be sort of point number one, is that there needs to be somebody in charge. They have ownership over it, and they take tough decisions, they make them, and the rest of the team falls in line with that. And then you also delegate decisions that you don't need to make. The second one is related to that, which is we split our equity equally, which caused a tremendous amount of friction over time. So that's one of the things that we talk a lot about in the book, is that splitting equity equally is a really, really bad idea. And I think we've been through it from experience, and it's just one of those things where it sends the wrong signal around, who is actually responsible, who's making those calls, who's making those decisions. And everybody's contributions, as much as we would like to say they're equal, they aren't equal. And so you need to account for those things so that you don't have friction later on. So I'd say those are the two things. I wish I would have listened to those. I'm sure, Will, you and Brad both counseled us against those things, and we probably didn't listen. So, there you have it, right?
I think my response to the 6 founder thing was, that's a lot of fucking founders.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Will, let's do the same, and let's time travel back, not to ViewLogic, which I think you count as your first successful company, but back to the one called Data something or other.
Yeah, DataWare. Yeah, well, that was I guess the first lesson is know something about what you're doing. And I probably ignorantly would have ignored myself. Yeah, I think.
All right, let's move. Let's forward to data to ViewLogic. So I wanted to.
ViewLogic,
it was your first successful company. It wasn't your first company, and that was the point I wanted to make. Was Raj's first company was successful, but your first company was not. My first couple of companies were not successful. And so as a founder, like, having the resilience to go through a couple of failures and keep trying is powerful. But so wind a little forward to ViewLogic. What would you have told your younger self at ViewLogic to do differently?
So I would have said, first of all, I would have said to myself, ideas just aren't that important. They're in the end we focused too much on trying to be innovative with ideas and try to craft something entirely differentiated by the idea right out of the gate. And we got a little lucky with the market, but we really weren't that differentiated. And in the end, what made us successful, but we had to get there, was the team and the execution. And I wish somebody had sat down and said to me, wish I had said to me, I had gone back in time and said to myself that this is where you need to focus. You need to really pound out who you're working with. What are their skills? What are they bringing to the table? Are they the same as you, or are they different from you? And different is better. Build a broader team and then execute the hell out of it in a real thoughtful way. We sort of hacked at things and got lucky and made a success out of it, but it was a lot of luck in our case.
Let's stay on this notion, Will, of the idea a little bit more. Maybe spend another minute or so on the notion that people fall in love with the idea and then hang on to it too tightly. And I've experienced that, Raj. You and I have experienced that together in businesses that we've done. What advice would you give to a founder that has fallen in love with an idea and is now holding on really tightly to that idea when you observe it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we talk about in the book is that there is an iterative loop that everybody should go through. Some of it's mental, some of it's physical, some of it is, basic things like when you have the idea, go and test the idea with potential customers. I mean, something simple as that, right? Go out and present it to somebody who might actually buy your product in the end, and have them, spit all over it, tell you that your baby is ugly, because they will and they should, and that is great. That is like the best part of starting a company, is getting that feedback and then saying, I know how to fix that, and then going and testing it again and fixing it again, because you're going to go through the loop a lot of times. And ultimately that's the fun of the chase of getting there and making it happen. And your idea may not look, the idea you build your final company on may not look anything like your original idea, and that's a good sign. That is the best possible sign that you're ready to go.
Raj, let's cycle back on the book a sec.
Brad, can I jump in on that? Because I want to just jump in really quickly. I actually think there's a reason why founders hang on so tight to their ideas. And I have a hypothesis, because you and I, Brad, experienced this, because I held on too tight to quite a few ideas. And I think it's this fear that you aren't going to come up with another idea. You're not going to have as good an idea for a new company or something like that. And so you hang on to it so tight because you're worried that you won't come up with something again, or it might not be as great, or it might not feel as great. And there's this massive truth that you have to get comfortable with, is ideas come all the time. They're a dime a dozen. There's so many ideas out there, and you will have lots and lots of ideas in the future. Maybe you won't have one immediately after you let go of something, but you will. It just takes a little bit of time. And Brad, you said that to me multiple times very early on, where you were like, why are we hanging on to this so tight? We can let it go. We'll come up with something else. And it's true. You do come up with something else.
Let's go back to a moment in time that I remember really clearly, that I think Raj links specifically to this. I remember it clearly because I was in my car driving to my place in Keystone, and I'd taken a different path because I-70 was all fucked up for some reason. And I'd gone through if people know Colorado, I'd gone up to Blackhawk, which I'd never done before, and sort of did that loop all the way around. And there's like a section that there's no cell signal. So we're like having this intense conversation, and then we cut out for a little while and I had to carry on. And this was the moment where JumpCloud became what it is today. So it shifted from where it had been and the idea that was being pursued to what has now become a very significant business. And that was the first time you and I talked about the idea of directory as a service. Talk a little bit about the shift and how that emerged for you, And not just how it emerged, but back to Will's comment of, okay, you got the idea, but how do you actually know that the idea is any good or not? What did you do now that you had this aha, this is the thing that we should be doing based on what we're hearing from our customers?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a really great question. So we had this concept initially for JumpCloud, and I think of it as we had 3 horizontal blocks to the product, and we were out there and we were getting some traction, but it wasn't sort of wowing people. It wasn't sort of moving as fast as we wanted it to. So we knew there was a problem. There was some issue that we hadn't figured out, and we kept gravitating to, say, one central portion of it, which in our case was basically identities and identity management, was one of the 3 components we'd built. And so we knew there was something wrong. We wanted to center in on that. And then one day, one of our colleagues said, hey, why don't we think about this as directory as a service? And that for me was the moment it just clicked. And I took those 3 components, which were all interrelated, and instead of having them horizontal, I visualized them as vertical. And what happened is it just totally changed how we thought about the problem. And then very quickly, I kind of in my gut, I knew, okay, this is it, right? This is the right thing. And then we very quickly did a bunch of testing with customers. So we got on the phone with them right away. We wrote some white papers and we had AdWords out there testing it. We talk about that in the book too. It's a great way to test your ideas, is go out and put stuff on the web and see how many people click on it, how many people download it, how many people contact you. It just gives you a little bit of a sense of it. And then when you and I were talking about it, I think your viewpoint was, hey, you have a lot of passion and conviction for this idea. So I'm excited about that because you're excited about it. I don't specifically know whether this is right or wrong. And it's tough at that point for any of us to have known whether it was right or wrong, but it was that sort of conviction and passion that we had around this concept that I think carried the day. And then we just figured it out. I'm sure it wasn't quite right even still, but then you just continue to iterate on it, iterate on it, iterate on it, and then you get it to be a little bit more close to what customers want.
You're talking about and using the example, I think that is well done in the book around this notion of how you deal with an iterative process and this sort of endless sort of iterative loop. Do you want to spend a little bit of time about the thing that in the book you call, or can you spend a little time around the thing in the book you call the vetting loop, and sort of how that works? And maybe I'll toss this one to Will. Just sort of describe what it is and how it works and how you apply it.
Yeah, as you say, it's sort of the cornerstone of the book. The idea is that there's a stepwise process to refining your idea, to testing your idea, to testing a market, to testing whether you can build a team, get money, and then check in to see, do you have something that meets all the criteria, or do you start the loop again? Or at any point in the loop, you can exit and restart the loop. Actually, we have a question from Brenda here that I'm going to hit on. It's so easy, as Raj said, to fall in love with your idea that it's almost difficult to dissect it. You don't want to break that purity of the idea that you have in your head. But the reward that comes out the end is so incredible if you just stick with it and test and get through every step of the way. And so we have like an 8-step process that tests things in we believe in a logical way along the path that starts with the idea, and then doing some basic testing on the idea of talking to customers. And then there's a big gateway, this product market fit gateway, which so many people hear about now. But it's really testing whether, are you building a product that people are going to buy? And it's absolutely critical. And that usually stops people in their tracks the first 3, 4, half dozen times before they go through the loop, because they find that, wow, I know I can build a product, but I can't find anyone who will buy it. Or I have a market, but the product I can build won't meet the needs of that market. And getting both of those sides together is the true gateway. And we walk people through in the book how to do it and how to iterate and the problems that they expect to have. So we also think it's a crutch because it says it's okay to go to the next step. It's okay not to go to the next step, and it's okay to restart along the way.
See one of the fun questions, and I see a couple of questions coming, and I'll encourage more. Sergey, I don't know if it's Sergey or Serge. I'm going to assume it's Sergey. I don't know what's happening behind me. It appears that behind me is a humidifier. So,
At least you're not on fire, Brad.
I think my wife decided that the Colorado smoke was a little overwhelming.
Yes.
To humidify ourselves, so that's what that is.
There's a lot of fires in Colorado right now.
Let's stay on this vetting loop, and I just sort of want to go back, Raj. I know how your brain works, and I've experienced your brain for many years. And I want you to talk around the notion of both a playbook, which of course is how you've approached the book as a playbook, but also how you approach thinking through problems. I think when one hears playbook, you often hear like, okay, well, if I just go from step 1 to step 10, then, you know, the answer will be, and I will have success, which of course is not really how it works. It's an element of the process. I'd love to hear how you think about your own process for making decisions and for working through things, and how you would reflect sort of then in the context of how somebody else would use the playbook, the startup playbook, to make decisions and to learn how to do things themselves.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess, you know, everybody's brain works a little bit differently. And I think, you know, you sort of reference the way I think about things, and it is in a very systematic way and sort of consistent way. And that's probably why this concept of a playbook emerged. And it is sort of step by step, and it isn't paint by numbers by any stretch. It's not the way it works, but there is a process to building a business. And I think that's what we wanted to share, is that there are steps, you have to go through them, and you can't cut corners. You can't just come up with something and just put it out there and think that customers are going to love it. Now, could that happen? Sure, of course it could happen, but the chances of that happening are really, really, really low. And that's our point on this, is that take a step, understand it. You can be as creative as you want in that step, but you are going to have to take that step. It's almost virtually assured that you will go through that step one way or another. And the question is, do you want to do it by your choice, your design, and on your timeline, or do you want to do it because you kind of got forced into it at the end because you didn't go through it the first time? So I think what we tried to do was make it much more systematic, much more maybe process oriented to go through it, but not losing the creativity in each step that's really needed, and we try and make that open. So I think that's the way we looked at it.
Well, when you think about the startup playbook and you think about some of the chapters that you wrote and the sections that you wrote, maybe think of one that came from a real sense of, wow, I screwed this up 3 times and I want to make sure I don't screw it up again. So I'm going to write it down and actually make it part of what we did. Do you have anything in the book like that?
Yeah, I actually have a bunch of stuff like that, especially in the second edition, where we added quite a few more stories. And it's funny, when Raj and I were sitting down writing the stories for the second one, we focused on failures, not because that was what we were trying to focus on, but those are the ones that stick most clearly in our heads, I think. Let's see. I think that. I think of one section of a company I was actually on the board of that really was about listening. It's you know, when the first 2 companies I started, I would say that I basically sucked as a listener. I was a doer. I got things done. But I would walk into meetings and I would listen to people, and I would go do it my way anyway. And I really wasted a lot of time because of that. And we talk about this in the book. And I've been on boards, and Brad, I'm sure you've been on many more, where you never expect people, the founders of companies to listen and take for granted everything you say, but you'd like them to take it into their calculus of what you're saying, bringing some wisdom to the table here. I'd like you to consider it. And often they don't, or sometimes they don't. And that is really unfortunate, because wisdom is really way more important than knowledge when it comes to this stuff. And anytime you can collect wisdom, it's really great. And I personally have lots of stories where I did not appreciate the wisdom of others. And some of those people still point it out to me. And so I have to live with it for the rest of my life.
Let's shift and do a couple of questions. We're about 30 minutes in, and I think there's a bunch of questions building, and some of them I want to knock off. I want to start with Kelly's question. What is the difference between vision and idea? We talk about idea and holding on to it tight, but how do you separate from your vision? And then how do you sort of underscore over a long period of time, your idea is iterating and it's changing because of what you're learning, but how do you deal with your vision in the context of that? Raj, maybe start with you.
Yeah, maybe I'll give an example, and I'll try not to make it too technical, but I'll use JumpCloud as a good example of the difference between an idea and vision. So the company's idea is a cloud directory service. So basically what we do is we connect a user to their IT resources. So you can log into an application, a system, a server, those kinds of things. We're the back-end infrastructure to that. Well, that's an idea. That is something that we're trying to do. The vision of what the company's trying to do is, we call it make work happen. And so the vision is, we are trying to enable our customers to be productive. We're trying to get them to be successful. And that vision is a much, much larger viewpoint. A cloud directory may be a portion of what we do to try and help an organization be productive and get work done in their organization and their company and as an individual, but it may only be one piece of that. So I think what we talked about in the book a lot is, you start with the kernel of an idea and then you build around it and you build an overarching vision for what that idea could be. And that's sort of how we think of it. The idea is just sort of the kernel, it's the start, it's where you begin. And then the vision is really that much larger overarching viewpoint, that picture that you have of what the future could look like for your company, for your customers, for your team, et cetera.
Let's pop back to something, Raj, you said earlier, and I will have you answer this question. It's another question by Kelly, which is the notion of equity splits. Raj, strong assertion that you shouldn't divide equity by, number of founders and share it equally. Will, what advice would you give to founders about how to think about the equity splits at the beginning, and what to do to sort of manage and modulate them?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, as we all know here, super hard problem. The way we try to rationalize it, there's a lot of emotion involved, and the way we try to rationalize it is to have a group of founders think forward, to almost do what is classically a present value calculation of what is the value that the person will add to the organization in the future, and then impose that into the current time. We see that too often companies get stuck, startups get stuck with who is bringing what to the table today. And today is a very short period of time. So it's, if somebody is the one person writing code, they seem insanely, it seems insanely biased towards them in terms of value being brought to the organization at the beginning. But it might be that this is really more of a marketing driven play, and that the marketing team or the person responsible for that is actually going to create more of the value in the overall entity. So, and that's even a hard discussion as it is, to say that, oh yeah, I'm valuable now, but I'm going to be less valuable later. Tough. But at least it starts to give you a basis for discussing the division in a different way than thinking about what's going on today.
Hey, Brad, I don't know if we've explicitly had that conversation with you. What's your perspective on the equity split question?
Well, I had two
'Cause
thoughts
you've seen it so much,
as
right?
you're making a strong assertion. So, um, two separate thoughts. One is I generally agree with it. I think that the default case of divide by number of founders, which happens a lot, I see a lot, is not a very thoughtful approach. It tends to be a reactive approach. And in the worlds where there isn't a lot of effort put into talking about it and thinking about it at the very beginning and having the hard discussion around it, and then putting characteristics around it like vesting, so that if somebody leaves in the next first year, second year, third year, like equity gets reallocated, like not dealing with that up front, I think is a mistake for a lot of founders. And it's interesting when I reflect on my first successful company, which was called Feld Technologies, and you both know my co-founders, Dave Jilk and then my dad, Stan Feld. In that company, initially, I think there was probably a conversation, between me and Dave about splitting at 50-50. I don't remember if there was or not. And I remember my father saying, that's not right. You shouldn't split a 50-50. I remember having to have the very difficult conversation around it with Dave. And we ended up splitting at 60-30-10. My dad wasn't full-time in the business, but he was an advisor, and I think he earned his 10% of the company over the years, although that was a leap of faith on Dave's part that he would. And between Dave and I think Dave got comfortable with the idea of that split, but it generated several difficult conversations at the beginning that didn't change our relationship, but definitely set expectations around sort of the early dynamics. So that's kind of one view. The other view, which is something I've been carrying a lot around in my venture world for many years, is the notion of an equal partnership. And when we started Foundry Group in 2007, we started as an equal partnership. And we had investing on our economics and things like that. But the idea that there wasn't a hierarchy in that mix. And I think that there are positives and negatives about that in the context of a partnership like a fund or a partnership like a law firm. I do not think that there are benefits to that in a business. I think the partnership concept in a business is very difficult. And you can be partners, but have disequal ownership, and there still is going to end up being, as you say, somebody who is ultimately responsible in that. And I can give a lot of examples, I think, of situations where partners in a business at the beginning very quickly evolved to a situation where there was a hierarchy, and the partner who was not the CEO in those situations often felt sometimes diminished, or often diminished themselves because of the dynamics, and that created problems if they weren't talked about at the beginning. They also cause problems when you're explicitly focusing on performance and execution, because if the person in the CEO spot is not executing for whatever reason, and you've got founders around the table, that's a harder discussion when you have, it's a different discussion, I should say, when you have no investors than when all of a sudden you have investors and you have a board and you have a whole different kind of discussion around performance. So, having that separation over time starts to matter more. And I don't know if that's.
Yeah, no, I think, Brad, the most important thing that you probably said out of that, or at least the most important thing I take away, is the meta of having that really difficult conversation. Because if you can't have that really difficult conversation about equity, the chances that you're going to be able to sustain the crucible of building a business and the intensity of that is probably unlikely. I mean, so I think the fact that you and Dave, for instance, had those difficult conversations is what made it so that you guys lasted like 10, 12 years, 15 years, the business. So that's a really, really long time. And it's, unless you've had those conversations up front and you can withstand those, the chances of the partnership or the co-founder relationship lasting is really low.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I'd add a second layer to it, right? Our business, we sold, it was 7 years. So we ran our business for 7 years. We had lots of emotional ups and downs together, but we never, we never revisited that, and we never struggled with that. And the emotional ups and downs had a lot to do with being first business and us growing. More importantly, though, is we are still extremely close friends, 35 years later. And I'd probably categorize, Dave as, other than my wife, Amy, Dave knows me better than anybody else on the planet. And it doesn't mean that we spend enormous amounts of time together, But that level of, we spend some, but that level of emotional connection that comes through fighting through the ups and downs, if you get that right at the beginning, persists. I have plenty of other relationships where we didn't fight through those things, and the relationships just don't persist the same way. I think of just another example, personal example here of a moment that we had where I almost broke our relationship. Both through a very bad decision on my part, but also a very uncaring way of approaching the decision in the context of our relationship. And I don't know if you remember it as vividly as me or want to talk about it, but maybe give the example from your frame of reference. And it's an example, I think, of how when something breaks or when somebody does something hurtful to somebody else in a partner or hierarchical relationship, because there we had a hierarchical relationship, you can still put energy into solving and preserving the relationship long term.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember the example, and I think in the end, what I take away from it is, in order to build a really, really strong relationship, you do have to go through some difficult situations, because you have to have the range of how do people deal with things. Do they care about you? Do they not care about you? If everything's sort of all good, up and to the right, if you will, like, you don't know what the issues are. You don't know what people really think. You don't know how they really want to interact with you. Do they really care about you? How do they care about you? I think people run away from difficult situations, difficult conversations, difficult whatever it may be. But I actually think we should probably make sure that those do happen. We do dig in, and they're inevitable. They're always, especially in building a company and in relationships, you're always going to have a difficult moment. And instead of running away from it, you kind of lean into it and say, is this other person going to lean in? And if they're going to lean in, you probably have something that could potentially last in terms of a relationship. And if they don't, then you'll realize that this isn't a relationship really worth leaning into. Now, in your case, you really leaned in hard. I leaned in hard, and we built this incredible relationship that has spanned many, many years, 25, 26 years, 27 years, I think. So that's really meaningful. And you are going to have moments where the relationship is tested. You have to. If you don't, then you probably don't have as deep a relationship as you really think you have.
Well,
you have to tear muscle to build it, right? That's the way it works.
Prepare muscle to build. Well said. And I'll underscore something, Raj, that you said, because it's something that I've continued to experience and work on a lot, especially in a position where I have I would say privilege and authority, right? The board member, the investor, like whatever decision I have, whatever resources I have, or power, like put that in the mix. Plenty of situations where I've been involved in removing somebody from a role. Lots of situations where I've been involved in replacing someone or having to, whether it was really my news to deliver or not, had to deliver really bad news to someone and about their performance, about their engagement, about something. And I used this phrase recently with somebody else. I'm not really negatively affected that much anymore by that role. It's still hard, it still sucks, but like you end up being in a position where you do it, even if you're trying really hard to be gracious and nice. And when I do something like that, I always try to give the other person an opportunity to maintain the relationship. I know I'm doing a thing that hurts you. I know I'm saying something that is disappointing to you or frustrating or that you disagree with. But I have respect for you, even if you don't feel it in this moment. And I'm willing to maintain and work on the relationship if you want to maintain and work on the relationship, some version of that. And I say it very generically. I mean, it's very situational specific. And what I found over the years is fascinating in a not very comforting way, which is there is a relatively small number of people on the receiving end of that who then do what you, Raj, did and lean in hard to say, this really hurt, but I care about the relationship. It's not, oh, I care about the relationship, I'm going to ignore that this really hurt, or that I disagree with you, or that you made a decision that I don't agree with. But I recognize it's your decision to make, but I care about the relationship. And so I'm going to continue to work on and invest in it. And as part of that, articulate how I feel. And it's something I don't see enough. I mean, I would say between co-founders is the big miss, where co-founders have a rupture, and the two co-founders then have their relationship destroyed because of the rupture. I see it between investors and entrepreneurs, where there's a rupture. An investor makes a decision. The entrepreneur may or may not agree with the decision, but if the investor has the authority or the right to make the decision, such as it is, that's life with that kind of thing. But then the person who's hurt doesn't say, okay, this hurts, but I want to still maintain the relationship. Or the person who is the one that is, saying, look, this is what's going to happen, is afraid to then engage deeply with that other person. It's bi-directional. It has to be both ways. I just want to underscore that. I know that was a little bit of a long rant, but you said it really well, because it takes both. And by the way, it doesn't have to be the next day, right?
Nope.
I mean, in our case, when we had that moment, like, it was not the next day. It was, a month or two later when, you asked me to dinner. I remember it so vividly. You asked me to dinner, and you started with, this is what you did that really hurt me. And I think you're wrong. But I will get over it, and I still want to have a relationship. And that was incredibly, I mean, that was many years ago, but that was incredibly powerful to me. Couple of knock off one quick thing. I saw Love says two founders are not always better than one. I want to come back to that in a second. I want to have Raj and Will sort of riff on that a little bit. And then the other, which I think is a good delve-in point, is equity splits. Have you heard of slicing pie? And the longer question, it seems logical. I don't know anyone who uses it. Many experts never heard about it. I've heard about it. I point it out to some people every now and then. I think it's an interesting tool as a potential approach. It is just one approach. And I think this is the important thing about equity splits from the beginning, and possibly why, like, slicing pie isn't the thing that everybody uses. Is if you think about the different approaches in the way that Will and Raj talked about it with the startup playbook, there is a way. And there's a way to think about future value of the person, and sort of map out into the future and sort of go back. It is really useful to always think about some of the ideas in something like slicing pie, and especially this notion that you have a fixed amount of equity, and you will give up more of it over time. And the important issue ultimately is not the number of shares or percent ownership that you have, but the value that you actually create with the company, and who the people around the system are that create that value. So I wanted to sort of make that point as a lead into the question of two founders are not always better than one. Is that a good truism? Or when you think about founders, 6 is a lot, 1 is a little. Is there an ideal number? And is there any real sort of, here's how you should think about the number of founders and what it means to be a founder, especially if you can tie it back to Startup Playbook and some of the suggestions the founders there? Will, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, cool. Almost always, if you're thoughtful about it, two founders are better than one. Look, I mean, the most basic point is that there's an unbelievable amount of work involved with starting a company, and just one person doing it all just doesn't fly. There's just too much there. And then the emotional ups and downs that every founder goes through are incredible, and having a partner in doing that is hugely valuable. Now, if you're not thoughtful about the partnership and who you're working with, then it can be worse than one. I'd say neither are good situations. So I think, I think Raj and I both agree strongly, in fact, that a team is what you need. 6 is too many, 1 is too few. What are the right number of people you need to do all of the core stuff for your product, for your market? It's difficult to tell, but it's, probably between, 3 and 4 kind of range, if you could just pick it on average. But the key is to be thoughtful about who you bring on, make sure that they're not complete overlaps with your skill set and your cultural set, that they expand you, and ultimately find founders, co-founders who will teach you every day new things. And you form a much stronger bond that way.
We'll do one last question and then sort of wrap up. Josie has a good question, which is, there are many costs to being a founder. Was there anything you had to sacrifice? And how do you keep up your mental wellness? So sort of two notions here, sort of as a founder, what have you sacrificed and what did you have to sacrifice? And how do you deal on a day-to-day basis as a founder and, you know, as a leader around your own mental wellness? And let's start with the first. Will, you know, what did you have to sacrifice? And Raj, maybe tackle the mental wellness piece.
So yeah, sometimes it's super subtle. And in fact, this happened last night. My wife, my daughter, and I were having a discussion about a certain time frame, which I won't bring up because it's a long time ago, when I was in my mid-20s. And my daughter said, "Dad, what were you doing in your mid-20s?" And my wife looked at me and she said, "Working morning, noon, and night." And actually, and I didn't meet my wife till much later greatly because of that. It is all consuming, and I'm not sure that there's a way to do it without it's not all consuming. It's mentally, physically, monetarily, health-wise, all consuming. You get sucked into a vortex, and I mean this in all the positive ways about it, although it doesn't sound that way, that you get sucked into this vortex that your startup becomes you become your startup, and you love putting all your focus, energy, and attention at it. You love it. And you don't think about the sacrifices at the time, but you give up those social relationships, or some of them anyway. You give up, you know, the ability to earn money, because when you consider 9 out of 10 startups fail, you make a lot more money if you go work for a big company somewhere. You know, the odds are that you will. And then, you know, mentally and physically, you forget to go to the gym. You don't actually stretch your mind in other ways. So, but it's all in enjoyment, and it's all in the drive and seeking that goal that pulls it all together. But you will sacrifice to be successful. It doesn't happen overnight.
I think an interesting thing, Will, I'll just jump in on, is the word sacrifice, right? Like, yeah, for me, all those things were there, but I don't view that as I sacrificed a bunch of other stuff, because I knew what I was getting. I knew the enjoyment, the benefits I was getting from it. So it never felt like I was missing out on something else, at least to me. So I think I don't think about it in that same way as it's a sacrifice, but I can understand how other people would look at that same thing in a different lens and say, well, you didn't get to do this, 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 and this, whereas other people did. But from my frame of reference, those things weren't that important to me, so it never felt like a sacrifice. So I think that's an interesting part of that question, right? That's the difficult part of answering that question from my side, is I have a different viewpoint maybe on what sacrifices are really made, or if any, right? Brad, you asked a little bit about the mental wellness aspect, and I think obviously you have a lot to add on that topic. I would say that for me personally, it's been finding a few things that I do really care about and making time for those things. So I don't have a long list of things that are super important to me, but the things that I try and make time for those things, and that's the way that I balance out the amount of time and effort that I put in, which, you know, obviously work is a huge part of my life and something that I really deeply enjoy, but I also have a couple of other things that matter to me, and I make time for those, and that's my balance point for my life.
Great. Let's just tack on one last question, because it came up while you were talking, and again, maybe back to either of you. From John: how do you convince an inexperienced team that a startup is all consuming?
Raj, I think you should run with that right now.
I don't know what the answer to that is. That's a tough one. It is. I think it is all consuming. So if a startup team thinks that they are going to found and I'll put it in our context, a high tech business that is going to be venture funded. So we'll use those caveats. And it's going to be basically a 9-to-5 job. I think you're absolutely deluding yourself. That's not, it's never going to be that way. And you just have to be honest with yourself. And this goes back to the founder relationships, founder discussions. You have to be honest with each other. And hopefully our book is pretty honest. That I'd say go read our book, because I think we're pretty honest about the amount of time and effort that it takes to build it. But talk to any other founders out there, and I can't imagine that there's any founders who think that the beginning of a company is sort of 9-to-5 and that's the way it works. So Will, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. There are some basics, right? When you hire people, you make that stuff clear. When you bring them in, you make that stuff clear. You ask people to do what you do, not what you say, right? So, if the founders aren't treating it as a larger than 9-to-5 thing, then nobody's going to do it that way. You have to start there anyway. It's greatly a part of culture, which is ultimately the thing that runs the company, guides the company, is the culture, is that, you have to keep making sure you're injecting it into the culture, that this is about, being pedal to the metal all the time. We don't run with our foot on the brake, to beat up car analogies. That's the way it's going to be. And over time, you transition the people who can't adapt to that out, and you hire people who can in, and that stays part of the culture. Not easy to do, but you have to do the brass tacks stuff right, or you'll never get there.
Raj, we'll wrap up. One quick piece of advice that you give to a new founder. Raj, you first.
I always say, find something you truly, deeply are passionate about and you love to do. So if you're not passionate about the thing that you're working on, I'd say go find something that you are passionate about.
Yeah, I would just extend that by saying, and do it with the people that you love working with, that you learn from, and that drive you and motivate you and become part of you. And those two things together will create killer startups.
100%.
Will Herman, Rajat, Bhargava, authors of the Startup Playbook and extremely long-term friends of mine. Thank you for spending an hour with me.
Thanks,
Thank
Brad.
you, Brad.
This is
Really
awesome.
appreciate your time.